Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week we'll be discussing the Met. Yes, once again, the Met, hiring German musicians for its New Year's Eve gala while its own orchestra remains furloughed. Then we'll discuss a Slate pitch about full naming classical composers. And finally, we'll talk with writer John Hong about the controversy surrounding the Institute for Composer Diversity. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Tiffany, what are we playing today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Two Truths and a Lie. Okay, here's how this works. I have chosen 3 musical excerpts, all ostensibly by the same composer, but in a sinister ploy, I have in fact chosen one excerpt that is not by the composer at all. My co-hosts will listen to these 3 excerpts and try to discern which gives lie to the following statement. This week's excerpts are all by Tchaikovsky. But before we get to the excerpts at hand, let's discuss what made Tchaikovsky sound like Tchaikovsky. What do you guys think?
Well, I love that we're going back to Tchaikovsky because we had a rousing round of listening limbo on Tchaikovsky ballets just a few weeks ago. And of course, in that discussion, we avoided the symphonies. So we'll see what kind of music we're going to. Ballet music, chamber music, I don't know, opera, ballet. Will, what are your thoughts?
I think with Tchaikovsky, you get a lot of repetition. I think that would be something that I would listen for. You know, a pretty standard romantic harmonic palette. Glorious melodies. You know, Tchaikovsky can be a clunky composer sometimes, though. Sometimes you do hear the seams in between his phrases and his forms. You know, it's as much as I think he's an amazing composer, he was not a virtuosic wunderkind like a Mendelssohn or a Mozart, where it all just seems to flow so naturally.
Yeah, there's effort into all of what he does, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, there's effort, and there's certainly pathos and melodrama.
Absolutely.
And he's a very expressive and emotional composer.
Oh, that all sounds like a great lowdown. Here we go. Excerpt number 1. Excerpt number 2. And excerpt number 3.
Very interesting. I feel like each one could have been the lie. So let's just go over the obvious things first. So the first and third works were very orchestral works. We're not sure if it's like a ballet score or something out of a basically an orchestral work, whereas the second one featured the cello solo with an orchestral accompaniment.
It started with cello and piano, and I was like, oh, wait, did Tchaikovsky write a cello sonata? And then I thought, well, maybe this could be... I didn't think that it was part of his piano trio because I know that piece pretty well. But then the orchestra came in at first strings, and then we heard the whole wind section. So I was able to make a pretty confident hypothesis actually about what piece that is.
Oh, okay. Would you care to share?
I think that might be Tchaikovsky's second piano concerto. Unless you tell me that that's a piece that you know really well and that it's not.
It is not a piece that I know well. I've only heard it once live. So I could be convinced that there was a cello solo in that.
In that concerto.
Yeah.
I was pretty confident either way that was Tchaikovsky, though, the second one.
And what makes it that for you?
Basically because I'm pretty sure that the third one is also Tchaikovsky, and I think that one is the outlier, and two did not sound so outliery to me. So I will admit that this was just a little bit of logical reasoning that got me there.
And we didn't get a ton of that cello solo piano duet moment, but it sounded like an end of a very like heartfelt like melody that was shared. That is very iconically Tchaikovsky.
Yes, that's a really good point.
So I definitely can see that. The first one, what I found interesting was it had certain elements of what would be Tchaikovsky, like harp and things that kind of made you think like, oh, maybe this is from a ballet. But then what really kind of got me to question it was the use of the glockenspiel.
And the celesta.
Was it a celesta or a glockenspiel? It's one of those like...
I think there may have been both.
So that, yeah, it seemed to me that was when my first reaction was like, oh, this is definitely the excerpt in which this would trip us up, right? To think that it's Tchaikovsky.
Even though we brought up on this podcast that Tchaikovsky was the first composer to use the celesta in an orchestral context. And I think that actually our unofficial official intern, Joseph Vaz, fact-checked me on that. It wasn't actually Nutcracker that was his first use of it. I think it was his tone poem Hamlet, or one of those tone poems. But I don't think that this was Hamlet. That excerpt just sounded like 20 years post-Tchaikovsky. It sounded more like 1910s, 1920s to me in the orchestrational style. And part of it was the use of all of that pitched percussion.
Mm-hmm.
What about the third one?
Yeah, you were so convinced that the third one was Tchaikovsky. Why?
Balletic, standard, it had a very light kind of Mendelssohnian character to it.
Mm-hmm.
Standard size orchestra, it sounded like.
What did you make of that like weird outburst at the end? These like...
Well, that was the next thing I was going to say, a big outburst, which to me is a very Tchaikovsky
But for
trait.
Clunkiness, that was the most clunky that I've heard of, I don't know, like, oh, okay, like that came out of nowhere. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, think of the Fifth Symphony, the second movement. I mean, talk about a big emotional outburst where you're not expecting, or the Sixth Symphony, the first movement, big timpani comes in and everything. I think Tchaikovsky is always trying to add drama to his pieces, and sometimes he does it in a very teenage angst-filled way, and so the big outbursts that screams Tchaikovsky to me. So I'm pretty confident that number one is the outlier here. How are you feeling, Kensho?
Yeah, I mean, either one or three could go either way for me, so I have to decide whether to jump on the Will bandwagon or go off on my own, which is usually what happens to me at the end of these games. Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to join you because the only qualm that I have with that is that weird outburst, and you've talked me off the ledge there, so I'm going to go one as the lie.
All right, well, we're in unison here. Tiff, tell us what it is.
Okay. Well, you're right about excerpt number 2.
Oh, oh no.
And Kensho, you should have listened to your instincts.
I should know never to trust Will.
Because excerpt number 3 is a early-ish tone poem by Vasily Kalinikov.
Oh, wow.
Called The Nymphs. And it is contemporaneous with Tchaikovsky. The Nymphs is from 1889. And the other two pieces, all of your observations are so good. I thought, the fact that the long extended instrumental solo in what is actually genre speaking a really bizarre work. The second excerpt. This is a piece called Concert Fantasia in G. It's opus 56 for piano and orchestra. So it's neither of the piano concerto that we don't know as well, but this is the second movement of two. And it starts off with, as Kensho noted, a long duet between cello and the solo piano. Number one is the Voivoda, opus number 78, a symphonic ballad for orchestra, and written in 1891. There is an opera by the same name that is written much earlier. It's like an opus in the single digits somewhere. This is opus 78. It's right in the height of his mature career. And then, of course, like when you said the Glockenspiel comes in and it doubles it for quite a long time. Like one of the things Tchaikovsky, I would expect the Glockenspiel to come in and maybe go out again. But the fact that it just stays in doubles does make it sound like maybe, somebody who's less kind of sure about himself.
Right. Yeah.
But that actually is Tchaikovsky, and a very bizarre Tchaikovsky by that point, which I think is why it doesn't get played as much.
That's interesting. Okay, and I just fact-checked it. This is the piece that Joseph told me was Tchaikovsky's first use of the celesta.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds. So we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the form, and you can upload a 30-second unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
Our old friends at the Metropolitan Opera in New York are making news once again, and it's more egregious than ever. After making an audaciously lowball offer to their musicians and stagehands unions this past fall, which we've covered extensively on this show, the Met's management has once again drawn the ire of the American Federation of Musicians. The complaint this time stems from the Met's live-streamed New Year's Eve gala featuring major singers such as Angel Blue, Pretty Iende, Javier Camarena, and Matthew Polenzani. The problem? The Met broadcast the concert from Augsburg, Germany, using non-union German musicians rather than the Met Orchestra, who, let us remind you, has been furloughed without pay since April. While there's no denying that the COVID situation in the U.S. is far worse than it is in Germany, and that New York City guidelines do not currently allow for in-person music making of any kind, it would also be naive to think that this was the best solution to the problem of, how should we do our big New Year's Eve gala online this year? All right, guys. Well, the Met said it again. I think that we have been consistently disappointed with the managerial decisions coming out of that institution. What did you make of this latest development?
It's past the point of being a little disappointed at this point. It's like sometimes when you see a really bad commercial, you're like, who approved this? Like, how could a group of people who are ostensibly at the top of their field come to a decision that is obviously reading so bad? And then of course you kind of have to get into like corporate psychology and group mentalities and what happens in a silo and these kinds of things and behind closed doors. But still, that's the question that I have in my mind, because it's really hard to see a proper justification here.
I put it into context because this is not the first pandemic era gala that the Met has had. They did a summer, I guess it's the substitute for the Met Gala that occurs every summer or spring. And that particular gala had featured artists, singers all around the world. They even had some pre-recorded performances by the Met Orchestra. Basically, they were tuning into, artists' living rooms with pianos, and they were singing and doing little arias and things like that throughout the event. So I just don't see how because obviously this was not a live performance that audiences could go to. This was still a live stream performance that people could see. What were the gains that they were hoping to get artistically from this? Because I can't see another reason why they would do something like this other than just we did a gala last time where we had to just, Skype people into the gala from their living rooms. Now we're going to live stream from Germany, and also some of these singers are American, right? So they flew.
Yeah, some of them had to fly to Germany to do this.
That's wild,
right? So I'm a little confused because I feel like the gala that they did this summer was quite successful. So no one would have objected during this time to still doing the same. So in a way, this is almost intentionally just cutting out the orchestra because everything else is basically the same, right?
Yeah, and I mean, if you're the average Met subscriber, I mean, you understand that opera is an international discipline. I mean, singers come from all over the world, and that's part of the appeal and the attraction, is that you're getting to hear the best of the best, right? The cream of the crop globally. But if I'm a Met subscriber and I see this production, this concert coming out of a church in Augsburg, Germany, to what extent do I feel like this is the Met putting this on? Because the Met does not employ solo singers like Pretty Iende or Angel Blue. They're not employees. They're not part of like a standing company. They are just oft turned to contractors. So like, how is this a Met production? Except for, I guess, that the Met rented out the church and then hired these musicians. But other than that, I mean, it's like, it's so...
Well, but isn't that how it works? Whoever has the pocketbook and is paying for the facilities is hosting the event.
But if you're a New Yorker and you see this, like, is this your Met? I mean, that's something that is conducted. We get told constantly. Oh, when you're introducing the orchestra or the company, you have to say it's your blank symphony. This is your Tennessee Valley Symphony Orchestra. We get told this all the time. Is this your Metropolitan Opera?
Is that what they want at this point? I mean, like, it's far afield enough of those mentalities that I'm just like, I wonder what the goal is. Like, I share your confusion, Kensho, because it just doesn't seem like it reads well from any perspective. We're in an age now where it's like, who cares what acoustic benefits that you gain from flying everybody over to Germany and putting on something that was a little bit more musical than all the rest of the things that everyone else has been doing. Who cares?
Yeah, and I would actually argue that it really made, because I watched the gala from the summer, and it actually was really more, I think, the most enjoyable like online live stream like gala performance, quote unquote performance, that I saw, I think, all summer, with people putting together these kind of online events. Because there was this kind of like, well, some people, I think like Roberto Alagna and his partner, like they did a duet, and like it was just so over the top, but then also like connection issues made it hard to hear them or see them. And then Jonas Kaufmann, our favorite Jonas Kaufmann, like was in this like living room where I remember people were like, is this where he lives? Like the greatest tenor of this, or the greatest tenor of this time is like in this like shabby living room with this pianist like coach. Like, what is going on? So it was actually fascinating and very humanistic.
Right. There was humanity and there was an expression of solidarity. And that is what this is such a slap in the face to, is like, yeah, okay, yeah. Groups, ensembles cannot perform in New York right now. They can't even film something. But like, lean into that a little bit, show that you have solidarity with your musicians and singers and chorus and stagehands, and, show that we're all in this together and that somehow we'll get through it, and have a little bit more creativity than as they showed that they could do. Or even, show a highlight reel. Like the Met in HD, their online service has
insane amounts of digital content. Yeah, the top of the line, like better than any other digital program you could ever hope to compile. Like, it's just like hours and hours and hours and hours of amazing stuff.
Of course, part of the problem is probably that all of those hours are conducted by James Levine, noted sex offender and persona non grata.
Well, what the other issue is about streaming past performances is it often requires quite a lot of wrangling for rights to, of making that stuff available. So that does obviously have its own difficulties, but so difficult that you'd rather like stage a production in Germany and like hire people who were, would it have cost them so much more to even include one or two Met musicians just to say, we are trying to include, and we can't fly our whole orchestra over here, obviously, but we need you to be represented. Like, would that, I don't know the red tape around such a situation. Obviously, the situation between the orchestra and management is not particularly good, but that sort of thing would have gone a long way, don't you think?
Yeah, and can we also just briefly look at it from the other perspective, not the other perspective, but another perspective of how I didn't really see so much outcry from singers about this so much. And while I don't fault any singer that participated in this event, because Lord knows everybody needs a gig or two these days, I definitely recall seeing a lot of like Instagram stories of like backstage from some of these singers being like, look at this great hall that we're playing, we're singing in tonight for the Met Opera's New Year Gala. We're so happy to be here. And then like even like took pictures or like, took recordings of like the German musicians that were hired to play the performance. And I just felt like maybe that wasn't the best. Again, we're talking about...
Do you think they just didn't... I mean, they hadn't thought about it? Is that like...
Right, but again, like, if we're talking about solidarity and we're talking about, this is the thing about the Met Opera, right? It's just, there's just so many...
arms
of the organization, and so it does require that much thought, whether you are an orchestra musician or a star singer or someone in the administration. Like, there's a lot to consider and balance, and I felt like maybe that wasn't the best taste in terms of kind of flaunting the fact that you're singing in Germany while the entire orchestra is furloughed.
Yeah. But let's talk about, I mean, if you were going to post something like that, is there a certain portion of our audience, the Met's audience, or the audience that is the social media circle of singers who might have posted such content, that would have looked at that and been like, wow, that's so awesome, here's some more money? Like, are the Met donors so... Is it possible now to have your head in the sand so much that you just don't know? You think that people are just doing, striding over huge obstacles to do great things, and look how wonderful this is.
Yeah, I think it's possible because just like look at what happens when you go into an opera house. Like, you don't see the orchestra. Most people are there for the singing, and they don't, most, like, your run-of-the-mill opera goer is not thinking about the musicians in the pit. They're certainly not thinking about like the contract negotiations or, knowing the inside skinny that these people have like all had to sell their instruments and move to their parents' houses in Florida.
And this is like the PR battle that the Met Opera Orchestra has battled, not just during the pandemic, but forever. The fact that I think the pit was actually even lower during Levine's time, where the orchestra was just like not visible at all. Yet I know that Yannick has brought the level up on the orchestra a little bit more, so they're able to be seen in the pit. And for the first time ever last year, the orchestra was brought on stage for like an entire orchestra bow for opening night of the Met, which was a kind of a big deal for the orchestra to be featured that way. So there's obviously I don't think that the audience really thinks of the orchestra as being equally an integral part of the Met Opera than its singers.
Yeah, I'm going to go a step further and say that like a lot of these things are basically banking on the supposition that the average Met listener / subscriber, or maybe even some of the big subscribers, won't give a shit if the orchestra is decimated and they end up having to hire an entire new group under a reduced contract, and most people just can't tell the difference, and great, that's a wonderful way to save money.
Well, speaking, Kensho, you mentioned Yannick, and of course that refers to Yannick Nézet-Séguin, the music director of the Metropolitan Opera. And once again, this is an instance, we talked about this a little bit on a previous episode, of where conductors get caught in the middle of trying to negotiate between their management and their workforce. And, the one thing that I think is worth pointing out is that Yannick and his partner have agreed to match donations to the Met Orchestra musicians. So that is both the orchestra and the chorus, and that they are matching donations from, I think, up to $25,000, like individual donations. So if any of our listeners do want to support the musicians, the orchestra and the chorus of the Met, you can go to metorchestramusicians.org and make a donation, which Yannick and his partner will be matching. But anyway, this is a...
Stay posted for the next outrage.
Yeah, seriously, yet more rather abhorrent behavior from the Met. And I hope that we don't have to keep covering the Met as much as we have been doing, and yet I can't say that I have much confidence in that. Well, with that, let's move on to our second topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
Is it racist and sexist to refer to some composers by their full names, but not others? In an article on Slate, Chris White, of no relation to Will, I think, an assistant professor of music theory at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, argues that full naming female composers and composers of color, while referring to canonic composers by just their last names, creates a linguistic inequality amongst composers and perpetuates the racist and sexist history of classical music. He writes, music critics, academics, consumers, and performers in the mid-19th through early 20th centuries thought about music history as a story of a few great men producing great works of art. Tied up in the respect and ubiquity afforded to these men is the mononym, or a single word sufficing for a person's whole name. These canonized demigods became so ensconced in elite musical society's collective consciousness that only one word was needed to evoke their awesome specter. Mouthfuls of full names became truncated to terse sets of universally recognized syllables. Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. Will, you have reminded us time and time again since the birth of this podcast to full name composers when we're referring to them on the show. So I'm going to go to you first. What do you think about all this?
Okay, well, first of all, we're talking about two different things here. So what Kensho is talking about when he trollishly makes that little intro to me is that I have encouraged my co-hosts and myself to avoid ultra slangy references to composers. Like if Tiffany at the beginning of her game today had said, we're talking about Tchaik, which is a very musician thing to do, I would have said, you need to take that again and say Tchaikovsky. And like musicians, we constantly say stuff like, Shasti 5 and Proc 2 or something, something like this. Just little slangy.
Who says Proc?
Okay, maybe you don't say that. But anyway, just little slangy references that, we use as a jargon, kind of a shorthand. And I encourage us not to do that because I want us to not confuse people. I want us to bring more people into the fold of understanding about classical music. I just want to make it a little bit more approachable. So now, par contra, I have heard from some listeners that they actually like it when we say stuff like Shasti and Tchaik and stuff like that because they feel like they're getting this little window inside. So maybe a little of it goes a long way. But of course, the reason that we have boiled it down to Tchaik instead of Tchaikovsky, instead of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 2 in C minor, is just out of habit, out of familiarity, out of ease of communication for ourselves. And of course, that's what's happened with a lot of these composers' names. Now, I will say that, when I give pre-concert lectures, I usually do full name the composers, at least at the beginning of the lecture. And in part, it's like with a different idea in mind. It's to humanize the composers. Like I feel if I talk about Ludwig van Beethoven, it's like, okay, yeah, you remember that this guy did have a first name. He is not a demigod. He is not an immortal. He was a person who went by a name, and you might have called him by that name, and that's cool.
Yeah, in fact, I love doing that. And I think I've probably done that more than a couple of times on this podcast, where we'll have been talking about Tchaik or Tchaikovsky for a few minutes, and they'll be like, "Sorry, Pyotr." They too were human. They had first names, and it's fine. All of it is fine. But scrolling down this article and also reading the comments section, I feel like
the comments section.
It's pretty special.
Oh, did I miss the comments section?
Yeah, the comments is like anytime you start chipping away at the godlike identity of major European historical figures, you get some pretty atrocious people coming out of the woodworks to say that this is PC cancel culture run amok and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I don't disagree that it's a little I'm not about to, I think, call all composers by their full names all the time. I don't think that's it's a non-issue for me. It's really such a trivial concern. We use names to refer to things, right? That is the purpose of a name. And if by using a name you happen to know exactly what I mean, then is there a need to use more name in the name of equality?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, Tiffany. I think I have definitely full name composers, but also I have in the last few months even have referred to composers as Price and Frank and Seeger
Right, and of course you're naming some female composers.
Right.
Well, let's put this in the context of what we all do, which is conduct rehearsals. And if you have a cycle in which you are studying 3 pieces, and one is by Beethoven, and one is by Gabriele Lina Frank, and the other is by Kaya Sarajevo, you're going to call all 3 of those pieces by the last names of their composers.
I think and maybe it's just like a pairing thing too, right? So a lot of the article takes a lot of time to say like, well, if you're introducing a program like that, then, you really shouldn't say Beethoven and then say Gabriele Lina Frank. If you're going to full name one composer, you should full name the other.
It's very context dependent, too. And don't forget, this is being written by an academic. So I think that his main context that he's thinking about is probably the classroom. But I also just think that, like, I'm on board with the full naming, like, first time out of the gate. And if I'm introducing a concert, if I'm on the podium and I'm talking to an audience, I would probably say, this is the 4th Symphony of Ludwig van Beethoven, and then go on to refer to him by Beethoven because, like, we know what you're talking about. But in a classroom context, and Tiffany, I'd be interested in hearing what you say about this because you've done more classroom teaching than Kensho or I have. Especially if you're talking about, like, music history for non-majors. And a Florence Price might be as unknown as a Franz Joseph Haydn, for example, to some students in the classroom. Is there an argument to be made that, we should full name these people, and that does kind of put them on an even playing field for somebody who's starting from a tabula rasa?
I suppose, but I almost would rather go the other way. If they're going to be able to get used to calling people by their last names, such as we do all the time in many academic fields, by the way, do you think every philosophy professor is always saying Immanuel Kant? Whoa, we're calling him Kant. Okay, that's what we're reading right now. And I would rather go the other way and just say, okay, let's take a look at the price. What is the problem? What other price am I going to be talking about? So I would rather go the other way rather than say, oh, by full naming, I'm putting everybody on an even playing field. I mean, I do feel as if the use of a last name denotes a certain standing in the field, and I don't have any problem with that. Obviously, we have to contend with the fact that the people who have come to the forefront of most fields has been a relatively homogenous group. But I really don't see actually how full naming everybody puts everybody on an even playing field really at all, actually. And, in this respect, I actually think that, Will, you said that this was the way you approach the podcast and direct us to say names on this show is a different issue than the one that we're trying to address. I think they're the same. I think the goal is to set things up not to exclude your audience. Mm-hmm. And so if by introducing someone by their last name only, there's some sort of tacit assumption that your listener knows exactly what you're talking about, which is the danger of using an abbreviation, or as a last name is for a full name, an abbreviation, right? Like it's a different kind of abbreviation, but still abbreviation. Your assumption is that your listener has some sort of intellectual context within which to place that reference. And if they don't have that context, it's your job as a public-facing educator or representative to give enough context. It doesn't have to give the whole thing, but enough, which is why Shostakovich is appropriate. And also, I guess, at some level, Dmitri Shostakovich is appropriate, but I don't see anything wrong with using Shostakovich in parlance, even to the relatively unclassically music initiated. I don't know. I mean, again, I think it's a bit of a non-issue, but I see it gets to fixing things in a very cosmetic way, I think, is my issue with it. It's like, I don't deny that the issue exists, but this is not going to, it's so cosmetic for me.
Yeah, there's far greater issues that we can solve before getting to the semantics of full naming or not, I think. But I think we've exhausted this topic for now.
Listeners, let us know what you think. And also, I mean, listeners, tell us if there are points at which, Will gave us an interesting secondhand piece of feedback about someone who had told him that they kind of appreciated hearing the insider lingo, shusty, chike. But I wonder, what's the inverse of that experience where you might have heard something at first and been like, oh, head scratcher, like not sure what that meant, and that made you feel somehow excluded. Like, I'd love to know if there are any moments like that, just for our own edification and improvement, because how this stuff reads on a micro intellectual level is the level at which this kind of language adjustment operates. It's really fast and hard to notice in many ways.
That just about wraps up this segment, but before we move on, we wanted to tell our listeners about our next book club. This time, we're reading something much more manageable than Wagnerism. This was a slim treatise called The Classical Revolution, Thoughts on New Music in the 21st Century by the Dutch composer John BORSTLAP. We'll only be doing one segment on this book, which is scheduled for our episode on January 28th. So if you care to read along with us, you can find a link to buy your own copy of the book in our show notes. Tiffany, on to our third topic.
Launched in January 2019, the Institute for Composer Diversity is an organization that seeks to provide resources to help classical music programmers analyze their programming with greater awareness of composer diversity in mind, and to help them discover works by underrepresented artists. The heart of the Institute is the Composer Diversity Database, a searchable database comprising, quote, composers and artists who identify as female or non-binary, composers of underrepresented racial, ethnic, or cultural heritage, and those identifying within the LGBTQIA2S+ community. As you might imagine, the Institute has been especially in the limelight this past year as the classical music world grapples with its own manifestations of systemic racism. And as of late, a lot of the attention has not been particularly positive. Composers have criticized its director, professor of composition at SUNY Fredonia, Rob Deemer, for his reductive and, at times, undesired categorization of composers' identities. Calls for Dr. Deemer to step down as the Institute's leader have abounded, citing missteps in dealing with the composers and Deemer's own status as a white, cisgender male. Here to discuss the issue with us is John Hong, a clarinet player turned classical music writer and marketing consultant, who last week was published by I Care If You Listen, a contemporary music blog, with an article entitled The Institute for Composer Diversity, White Leadership, DEI Initiatives, and Ethical Advocacy. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
John, so most of our listeners won't have read your article, so why don't we just start with your giving us a basic frame of your takes on this issue and your suggestions for how the Institute can better itself.
My approach to writing the piece was pretty simple. I'm extremely online, very on Twitter in particular, in new music Twitter, as it's often called. And I really paid attention to the growing conversation around what was first the Composer Diversity Database. So even in 2016, 2017, especially as the Me Too movement happened and all of these, there was a lot more social conversation around race, gender, and with that came efforts to solve that problem, particularly within classical music, within the symphony world in particular. You started seeing call-outs of the Chicago Symphony, of other big organizations for continuing to announce seasons that had zero women, zero composers of color. There seemed to be a void for enterprising individuals and organizations to come in and solve that problem. Mm-hmm. So the first one and the most prominent one that caught my eye was the Composer Diversity Database. And it seems like a really good idea. It seems like one of the good guys of, oh, great, now we can, people that want to program more diverse programs, whether it's on no matter what level, you can actually go and you can search for, composers of a certain race or of a certain gender or things like that. Seemed like a good idea. And at first, I was actually on the side of thinking that any criticism of it was kind of overblown. I would start to see rumblings of this shouldn't be run by a white guy. Dr. Rob Deemer, of course, is a white man who founded the organization. And it seemed a little unfair, like why, I think solving racism needs all the help it can get. But it seemed unfair, and I was wondering if that really had any merit. And then The real sort of crux of it was that it changed from the Composer Diversity Database to the Institute of Composer Diversity. So changing from just kind of a simple online database that you could search into more of a organization that conferred sort of a heavier weight of status. People didn't really feel represented, which I felt interesting considering composers seem to be of the demographic that would benefit from having their name in a widely viewed database. You could really boil down the criticisms to Rob led with his ego in creating the Institute for Composer Diversity rather than a true desire to serve the composers.
So just as a bit of context for our listeners, the database, which was the pet project that Rob Deemer started with, is basically a volunteer-run organization that was begun in 2016. And then in the shift to being the Institute happened early 2019. And in John's piece, he explores I guess it feels a little semantic, right? So what? It turned into an institute rather than the name of a database. But you explore a handful of points about the fact that it's labeling itself as an institute that help us kind of understand what we as the public inherently see as an institute's place in guiding the discourse. So would you mind talking a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main issue is that if you could boil it down to a single sentence, is that the Institute for Composer Diversity punched above its weight a little bit. So the reason it went from the Composer Diversity Database to the Institute for Composer Diversity was so that it could receive donations under a fiscal sponsorship. So it became fiscally sponsored through Rob's workplace, the State University of New York in Fredonia. And that confers an extra sense of, we're important, we're authorities. Mm-hmm. And when you get seen as an authority in a space as fraught as diversity, as trying to quote unquote solve racism, there's an extra responsibility that comes with that. And I think when you experience such rapid growth in what Dr. Deemer calls his fundamentally a research project, then you sort of when I spoke with him for probably an hour and a half, 2 hours on the phone, and he really kind of held two views simultaneously, which I thought was very interesting. One was that it was just his research project that he started in his classroom, that just trying to get his students to be more aware of women composers, and it just kind of grew over time to this place where now he felt like he could have a really large impact. And I think the problem just stemmed with a choice he made, which I'll actually just read his quote here. He said that it's great to say, quote, you should be doing more X or programming more composers for different groups. But at what point do we have a goal? Are we going somewhere? So I made a conscious decision to try to not just be Switzerland and say, here's the information, do with it what you will, but to advocate, saying, hey, here's a way for you to be able to think about programming maybe differently than how you've been doing it before, end quote. So you can see his thinking here, right? Like, I have an existing platform. How do I increase the impact of my platform? But he does that by stepping into a place where, instead of just making this resource available to anybody of, I want to program, a Black composer. Here's a place where I can search for Black composers. Great. He turns it into, this is how many Black composers you should be putting on your season. This is how many composers of color, women, this gender, this demographic, etc. And I think that's where, when the decision gets put only on a white guy to determine what those percentages are, that's when it becomes a little fraught, in my view.
So it sounds like the distinction that you're making, and I think this is a really important one, is just the conversion from being a resource to becoming an advocate. So I think that's the delineation that we're making here, is if he said, here's this amazing resource that people can refer to, and then just stay away from those percentages that he's now setting the bar for every orchestra in terms of what they have to program, because we already have enough white males making those decisions anyway, so we don't need another person to be doing the same thing. My question was, in speaking to him, did you feel, or did it confirm for you what you had heard from others about this being an ego-driven kind of decision, or was it more of somebody that was trying to take advantage or capitalize on the attention and funding that they were receiving for their work?
I don't think he's a particularly egomaniacal, like evil person that can sometimes, I think some of the criticisms I saw push towards that direction. I just think that objectively that is a little extreme. But what I will say is that he really did seem to have a sense that this is my sort of research project, and just to be asked to step down because of my identity, because I'm a white guy, he didn't seem to think that that merited a reason that he should resign. And you can sort of empathize with that, honestly, of you start this thing and it becomes bigger than you thought possible, and then you get asked to step down from the thing that you basically built from the ground up. I think any reasonable person would have resistance to that. But in my piece, I try to go beyond that sort of empathetic approach to see what's better or worse for, again, quote unquote, solving racism, contributing to making things better for people that are not white men in the space of classical music. And I think the main sort of reason why I see some merit in asking him to either step down entirely, or at the very least share power and accountability with a person who has lived experience of a Black person, go down the list. I think it's just important to not have the only decision maker, or not the only decision maker, but the final decision maker be someone that is a white guy.
And that is your response to the fact that, recently, more or less, they have tried to aggregate a leadership team that does include voices of people of color and from the very backgrounds to which the Institute purports to advocate, right? And your response to that is, well, he's ultimately still at the top.
Yeah, exactly. It's to their credit, and to, Dr. Rob Diemer's credit, he did respond to many of the different sort of controversies that happened under his watch, and said, okay, we're going to change our practices. We're going to have a leadership team of people. Currently, it's 4 volunteers, that none of whom are white men. And I did speak to Siad Wells, who's on the leadership team, and I can't disclose what we spoke about because of an agreement I made with her. Other than that, I spoke with her. But overall, I think she, in no way did she say like Rob Demerson's evil person at all. Quite the contrary. Mostly I think she was just like one of the composers who were frustrated with the ICD to know that it just can't be all things to all people. But I think there's a disconnect between that view and the view that Rob tends to lean towards with what the ICD can do, which is a much more ambition-heavy, like being a real player in the diversity space as classical music tries to move forward in more inclusive ways.
So, John, can you talk a little bit about, you have proposed some solutions about what next steps the Institute and Rob Diemer might take, including setting it up as a nonprofit 501c3, maybe bringing it back to its original idea as just sort of a research project database, and getting rid of this capital I Institute type thing. Can you talk about some of those solutions and why you think that they would be good steps moving forward?
Yeah, in the piece I wrote, I come back to this distinction between the capital I Institute for Composer Diversity, the difference between that and the lowercase I idea of an institute. And I think, again, that's where sort of the pitfall was in changing to the uppercase I Institute. It really conveys this, we can address we have a bunch of resources, and we have a bunch of ways in which we can solve problems, and
personnel with certain expertise, which is maybe what they're lacking.
Right, exactly. I mean, fundamentally, it's a volunteer-run organization still. They accept donations to keep their website running, but nobody gets paid, including Dr. Diemer. But in terms of the solutions, I really think one is the name is a big part of the sort of friction between it. The second would be I wrote aggregate, don't dictate. So aggregating meaning take resources that have already been written by those with the lived experience and research experience to make those kinds of calls, instead of putting honestly arbitrary percentages up on your website as this is what people should do. These are the minimum standards that should be met. And yeah, it really struck me that there was no real reasoning provided on the website for why 29% of your program should be women, for example. Like, okay, that's great. I'm glad they're trying to move it in a forward direction. That's certainly more than now, but for it to really be a useful resource, you have to at least provide some reasoning for why, even if it is just your own opinion, which even that, I don't think it should. I think it should be based on more research-oriented methods. So aggregate, don't dictate. It would be solution number 2. Accountability from the community, I think, is really missing from the ICD currently. And frankly, that was a huge contention with the ICD and it's the composers that it includes in its database, is that they don't feel heard when they say they want to, when they have a criticism of how not just they're represented, but of the direction of the database in general.
Right. And one thing I think it might be worth saying is just that, this, given its basis as a research project, this was just Dr. Diemer and his assistants kind of going out and finding people who they thought fit into these categories. This was not an opt-in situation for the artists who were included. And I think that's sort of challenging and problematic, because especially if you're dealing with people on like the queer spectrum or something like that, you don't necessarily know how somebody identifies racially. I mean, in any regard.
Exactly. So I think there were efforts made to sort of try to do that, but ultimately, when it's a volunteer-run database, I think he really prioritized volume over quality. And yeah, it caused a lot of issues and controversies of, there was one artist that was sort of featured as the, Black, it was right after George Floyd's murder, and she was featured as a composer on just like on a spotlight feature on the ICD's website. But she didn't consent to that, and she was labeled as a composer when she doesn't consider herself a composer. So that caused a whole controversy. And then they had to retract the feature of her. And so I think that is in a vacuum illustrates sort of the mentality that the ICD has been governed by, a mentality that, by the way, is reflective of leadership decisions of, we want this to grow, and that's going to be our first priority, as opposed to we want this to be done with as much care as possible for composers, even if that means sacrificing both.
I wonder if you, John, you have thoughts about just the process in general, right? So I think we're 3 conductors here. So we've definitely opened up some kind of database or book that suggests, composers of a certain era or and we always go by category in terms of whether that's the length of time, the duration of the piece, or the ethnicity of the composer, or when it was written. And so when it's so categorically driven, this process of programming and discovering new works, obviously we have a lot of issues that will come up now that we're becoming hopefully a more woke society, and we are trying not to stay within these kind of like, well, this person is X category, so that's why we're going to program them. So do you have some sense of how we can more thoughtfully program? Of course, these databases are useful, but I think there needs to be another step of kind of just being more thoughtful or comprehensive in our research for each kind of programming endeavor.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely correct in that databases, there are definitely limits and even dangers in having that be sort of the main solution available to people who want to, you can't just click 3 boxes and say, great, our organization is no longer racist. And I think one of the main complaints I saw within the composers, which whom I'll defer to here, is that there's not a sense of, okay, how do organizations build relationships with the composers that they program beyond just commissioning them, or even just getting one of their pre-existing works onto their program is, okay, how do you reach out to them and incorporate them into what you're trying to do as an organization? In general, I think it just needs to be a more collaborative space between those who write the music and those who program and perform the music.
Well, this is certainly an interesting institute/organization/database, and I'm really interested to hear if we have any listeners who are composers of color or part of any of these communities. And we'll certainly continue to communicate with John and all the others covering this interesting issue. So last thing, John, would you mind sticking around and recommending something for our classical mixtape?
Absolutely.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, John, what do you have for us?
I don't actually listen to classical music as much these days, but when I do, the Brahms Piano Trio No. 1 in B major, I'll come back to it over and over and over again. My favorite recording is, quote unquote basic, but I really do think it's the best. Yo-Yo Ma, Manuel Axe, Leonidas Kavakis. They have this great interpretation on YouTube where Leonidas is just right before, as Yo-Yo Ma's playing, he's just staring in just this wonderment, and while Yo-Yo is playing the theme. Yeah, it's just a perfect encapsulation of why classical music is special to me. Just the interplay of how themes can layer on each other and create something so beautiful.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks for being on the show. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
So I thought it would be apropos to bring today a work that I found not in the composer diversity database, but by way of kind of poking around a little bit. This is a work by a composer named Stella Sung called The Dance of the White Lotus Under the Silver Moon. And it's performed here by Susan Robinson on the harp and Sarah Stern on the flute. The composer writes that this piece was inspired by her appreciation of Chinese and Japanese screens, which often depict scenes of nature and natural surroundings. So, of course, it has all those oriental scales. But this was originally to be played at a concert that was canceled due to COVID last year by the 21st Century Concert, which is the purveyor of this recording that I've brought to you today.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. Kensho, what do you have for us today?
All right. So, after experiencing a treasonous attack on our democracy this week, I needed to just listen to some music that would make me calmer than I was on Wednesday. And so I have picked a movement from an album of Mozart quartets by Quartet No. Which is one of my favorite quartets and also might happen to be my favorite album of quartet music right now. And this movement is the second movement, the Andante from Mozart's String Quartet No. 15 in D minor. I just think they'd use silence so well in this album throughout the movements and everything. So, I mean, if you just listen for the silences, I think that's actually what makes this recording particularly awesome.
Well, thanks so much, Kensho. For my selection this week, I have also chosen Mozart. I have chosen the very ending of The Marriage of Figaro. This is when the Count sings Contessa perdono. This is a moment in the opera where the Count, who is the most powerful character, also by far the stupidest, and who is basically nothing more than a lying scumbag, who has tried to convince every other character that the truth that they see in front of them is not actually the truth, and has tried to lure them into a ruse, is caught. And what does he do when he's finally unmasked? He admits that he is wrong, he tells the truth, and he apologizes to his wife and by extension the other characters in the opera. Now, I know that opera is not real life. I know that this opera has 100 themes that I would not like to see in real life, that it is antiquated and based on 18th century morality in 100 ways, and I would agree with you. But there are certain things that we could all stand to learn from this scene. You'll find the links to all of these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about our show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.